Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, and in today's episode we are going to be making a montante, a large sword, big giant sword. It's been a bit of a theme on the channel lately. Now, before we get into it, I should mention today's episode is going to be a little bit more build focused rather than testing focused, and the reason why is because this episode was actually supposed to go out on my second channel, my Tyrant's channel. You should subscribe if you haven't already. I barely post on it, but it was originally just going to go out on that channel, but I thought it was such a fun episode and I thought you guys would enjoy it that I decided to put it out on the main channel. So it's going to be a little bit different than usual. Now, why do I want a montante other than it's obviously I want one because everybody wants a big sword. The reason why is obviously demonstration purposes, training purposes. It's also really important for like reference and things like that, and they're really cool, of course. So I've been looking at buying one for a long time, but they're very expensive, like, you know, very expensive swords. Now, the thing that actually pushed me to really decide to do this was the Titan sword project, the last giant sword project we did, because we made it out of aluminum, and you can probably see where I'm going with today's episode. Now, there are aluminum swords that exist, usually for things like stage combat because they're a little bit safer, or maybe like movie productions because they look good on camera without being so heavy and they don't hit as hard, etc., right? But I've never seen any like big swords made out of aluminum until I did the Titan sword project. And when I did that, the biggest takeaway that we got from it was the flex on it. The flex on it was actually really impressive. Now, this is really important for a real sword because it needs to be able to flex without bending or breaking. Now, the aluminum was able to bend and flex to a rather impressive degree, and that's what inspired me to decide to go down this route for my montante. So that's kind of the backstory for everything out of the way. So let's get started with today's project. It's going to be fun, like I said, a little bit more build heavy than usual, and then we'll do a little bit of testing at the end. Hopefully it doesn't break. Hopefully it works. So getting started with our montante, the first thing I'm going to do is lay out my designs and my patterns onto the bare aluminum flat bar so that I know where I want to put things, essentially how I want to cut the tang, how I want to machine in, you know, things like little fullers. So let's start with the fullers. I'm going to throw this onto my mill. Now this is interesting because my mill is not a big mill. It is a very small milling machine, and I have something that is huge, nearly 2 meters long of flat bar. So this is probably the biggest thing that I've ever machined on my mill, and it is not made for this at all. But it kind of worked, and the reason why I say it kind of worked is because I'm using a ball nose end mill. They are very, very tricky end mills to actually machine with, and the reason why is because you need your workpiece, you need your mill, you need everything to be completely rigid to get a good finish. Now, obviously, this is a big piece of aluminum that's flopping around. It's not held very securely, so I wasn't able to get a very consistent finish, which I completely expected. But it did do, generally speaking, it did do the job. So then after the fact, I threw it into my vise and grabbed out my Dremel tool and tried not to slip and, you know, put any gouges into the blade itself and try and fix up the fullers a little bit. I did slip, but because this is a training blade, it is what it is. The next thing I did was cut out the angle for the tang. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the tang later when we get to the handle portion, but after that, it became the long, arduous process of grinding in the bevels. Now, obviously, because this is not going to have an edge, this is a training sword, it's not sharp, it's not a functional sword, right? It's a training sword. So I'm just grinding in aesthetic bevels and to remove a little bit of weight, of course. This took a long time. It always takes a long time. Same thing with the giant sword. And then after I've got most of the bevels roughed in, I then threw it onto my belt sander. And the same story with the mill. My belt sander is nowhere near made for such a large piece of material. It's just, they are not made for this. So this was really difficult. When I do these sorts of projects, I just don't have enough space to handle such large pieces of material. But I was able to get a good surface finish, at least down near the base of the blade. But I did want the bevels up near the base of the blade to look nice and crisp and look somewhat professional. Then moving over to the crossguard. Now, the crossguard is a really complex piece. There's a lot of nuance to it, like I said. So what I did was I started out with some mild steel, some square bars, and some bits that I machined out, and essentially welded them all together because I didn't have a crossguard that was big enough. This is a large sword and needs a really large crossguard. And after it was welded together, as you can see, in its rough state, it looks terrible. So a lot of grinding, machining, using the Dremel tool, essentially using every tool that I have, right, to turn this into a nice functional crossguard. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out in the end, but it was quite a complex piece to make, as crossguards usually are. Now moving on to the handle, this is where we get into the interesting stuff. So originally I wanted to make it out of a solid piece of hardwood. Usually how I'd make a handle is I'd make one side of the handle, the other side, and then glue them together and you get a solid piece, right? However, this is one of those times where I want the handle obviously to be comfortable and to be the right thicknesses and all that sort of stuff, but at the same time, I don't want to make the tang very thin like I would on a regular sword, you know, within proportionality, of course. I want to keep that tang as thick as possible because we're working with aluminum. So I opted for more of a knife construction. So the two halves of the handle actually become scales, and I essentially used a hardwood plywood. I think that's how you describe it. So it's a hardwood, but it's a plywood type thing. Never used it before, especially for like a sword handle, because why would I? But it actually came out pretty good. It had no issues with it, and to work with it, it was perfectly fine. It's also all I had in the workshop, so I made it work. So once I cut out the handle scales of the plywood, I then started grinding them away. I'm gonna go for like a diamond cross section, and we're getting close to the assembly point. So because I'm going for a knife scale construction, it means that everything's going to be essentially epoxied together. Whereas a regular handle, I could probably, you know, put everything together and do a threaded pommel, and things could be removed and replaced if they needed to. But because I need to keep this as strong as possible, and I have to go for this sort of construction method, especially with the handle, it means that the handle scales need to be epoxied to the tang. So the crossguard needs to be finished before we can start assembling. So the crossguard got finished, then we needed to epoxy on the scales to the tang, and I can continue grinding the handle, because usually you don't want to do it like this, right? I'll complete the handle and put it on after the fact, but in this case I need to complete the handle after it's been epoxied to the tang. So I'm kind of doing things a little bit out of order, how I would usually do them at least. So after the handle is a nice diamond cross section, it's been grinded away exactly how I want it, and it's nice and comfortable, I'm going to char it. After I char it, I'm then going to add a bunch of little leather risers. I simply just use some super glue and some you know, hobby glue to get these to stay in place. Then after that, usually at this point, I would actually wrap the wood in a cord and then put the leather on, but because I want to keep this handle really thin, I'm just going to put the leather straight onto the wood and leather risers. So now we need to choose our leather for the handle, and we're essentially spoiled for choice here. We can either go for a nice beautiful wine red, or maybe a burgundy, or if we're feeling really risky, we can go for a maroon. So we have plenty of choices. But what I decided to go with was this beautiful kangaroo leather. I've never used kangaroo leather, especially for like, you know, a sword hilt. So I'm actually really curious how it will take on the impression and, you know, its form and all that sort of stuff, because I've used all the other leathers before, but kangaroo leather specifically for this purpose, never tried it before. Anyway, spraying the handle in an adhesive and spraying the adhesive on the leather, I then contour it around the I hate doing this part. It's always so difficult, especially to try and do this while you're on a time limit, because the glue is going to dry, while also trying to film it. It's really hard to do. But I eventually got the form that I wanted. I then stitched up the seam. There was a little bit of an issue with the stitching. I cut a little bit short in one area, so I may actually replace the handle, the leather on it at some point, but for now, for the purposes of today's episode, let's just continue. Then with the leather attached securely and firmly to the handle, it's now time to put in our impression. So what I'm going to use is a 1.5mm nylon cord. It has a nice little rope texture to it. I'm going to very, very tightly wrap this around the supple leather. I do wet it a little bit before I do this. And when I say a little bit, I'm not soaking the leather. I'm just getting it to absorb some of the moisture, just to make it a little bit more pliable. Then I'm going to wrap that nylon cord all the way around to imprint it into the leather itself, and I leave this for around, 24 hours, 2 days, that sort of thing. Then we unwrap it and have a look at what we actually got when it comes to the pattern itself. And honestly, I don't think it's too bad at all. like I said, first time using kangaroo leather, so I had no idea what to expect. Now we're getting into the home stretch. So for the pommel, I just used this old pommel that I had from a different sword. You know, it's made out of stainless steel, it's the right weight, it's proportional, so it's a good counterbalance to this particular blade, and I like the design. I threw that onto the lathe and machined in 2 lines to match the aesthetic of the crossguard and the blade itself. Now the blade is essentially done. All I'm going to do is polish the blade itself with some metal polish and then put on some nice leather conditioner onto the leather so that it remains nice and soft and supple and it doesn't get damaged. But with that out of the way, let's get to the B-roll and then let's start swinging this thing around. Let's see if it even works. So this here is the finished and final montante. I am incredibly happy with how this thing has turned out. I think it looks absolutely awesome. I've only spun it around a little bit so far, but it hasn't broken yet, and the blade is still incredibly straight and true, so I think it actually is a success. I was really worried because obviously I haven't had anywhere to actually be able to spin this around yet, so I was very worried that I'll get out here and immediately break it. But I am very happy to report that it seems to be holding up and it seems to be a success, which is really awesome, because that means like I only spent $150-ish on all the materials for this and maybe like a week of my time. That, you know, it did take a while to make, but it was only about $150 of material, which is a hell of a lot better than like $1,000. So I'm really happy with it. Let me know your comments down below. Let me know if you think this thing turned out really, really good. I'm probably also going to add on some rings because I wanted to make it, you know, something like this, right? I think this looks a little bit sci-fi-ish, maybe it's just me, but I went for something a little bit more fantasy and sci-fi because I don't think we see enough cool, you know, large sword designs. Obviously, we have a lot of montantes and historical swords that are very historical, but I wanted something a little bit different, a little bit more fantasy, and I think it looks really cool. I'm happy with the design, but adding some rings on when I want, I think will be a good compromise between historical and a little bit more fantasy, but those rings will be removable when I get around to making them, essentially. It's the right size. The weight is a little bit light, but barring all of those things, it is absolutely incredible. I'm really happy with how the crossguard came out. I'm really happy with how the handle came out. Obviously, we don't really have the indents from the leather because obviously this is the kangaroo leather, first time trying it. Since I obviously completed it, it's been, you know, a week or two, and it has lost a little bit of that texture, which is, you know, not ideal, but it's a lesson learned, right? Because this is the first time using this type of leather. In terms of how it feels in the hand, it feels absolutely incredible. I'm really happy with it. And more importantly than anything else, and this is the most important part, it works. It works. It's really good to have one of these finally in my collection that I can use for training purposes. Obviously this is a blunt aluminum edge. I'm not gonna be able to cut anything, but that's going to be all. Thank you guys for watching. Obviously not really much testing today. It was more of a build focused episode. It is a proof of concept that actually works, and I'm incredibly happy with it. I think this thing looks awesome, and I'm really surprised at how well it actually functions. This is a training sword and it can be used for training now. So that's going to be all. Have a good one, guys. Thanks for watching.